It's really a big pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, my very good friend, Sharon. And to Bet Simchat Torah, I really wanted, it's been a really long time that I wanted to be with you in person, physically. So at least we can do this live. So Zoom is giving us some opportunities, I guess. And especially at these times, it's really important for me to send a big hug to you who live in New York, and to tell you to stay strong and continue to help each other and bring the community together, as you, Sharon, are doing in such an incredible, inspiring way, and as your community is doing for such a long time. This is a really difficult time, but I hope that we will end this crisis as fast as possible and also reach maybe a few conclusions about how we should run our lives in the future. So here in Israel, it's almost 3 a.m. and I had in the past, a few hours ago, I traveled around my 500 meters radius in Tel Aviv, and noticed that many of the synagogues decided to hold their ceremony, their Shabbat service, outside in very small groups of 10, 12 people. But them doing this outside, and here in my neighborhood in the south of Tel Aviv, you have many, many very different communities and streams of Judaism, and to walk around the street and see all of them doing it in public, on the street, and actually allowing the community to, for some people for the first time, to see the service, was really exciting. It was a really beautiful sight. And I think we are seeing some really incredible things like that throughout the past month and a half almost that we're in a lockdown here. We had in Israel a very difficult week. The week of the Independence Day, the 72 Independence Day of Israel. Independence Day is always celebrated a day after the Memorial Day for the many, many lives of soldiers who were lost in war and because of terrorism, and many citizens as well who lost their lives during the time from the very beginning of Israel. And these 2 days are very close together for a reason. It makes us, in a way, on Memorial Day, and in the sunset of Memorial Day, think about the huge sacrifice that thousands and thousands of Israelis did in order to make Israel happen. And for me personally, the Memorial Day is also the day when I think about my own responsibility and our responsibility as leadership. I think Memorial Days are not just to remember. Memorial Days for leaders are to think, what are we doing in order to make this end, in order to make the last life of a soldier or a citizen who died because of the conflict being really the last. And more than that, it's a day for us to think if their sacrifice is, if we are working hard enough to make their sacrifice worthy in a way. And I think at this year, when Israel is confronted by enormous political challenges, and not just, the virus is a big challenge, but it's just one challenge that we have to confront these days. We're confronting for the past year mainly, but for the last decade, and the last few years more than ever, we're confronted by the challenge of keeping our democracy alive. So if in the past we could look at the challenges that we have as a nation, the biggest challenge, in my opinion, would be the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We could look at these challenges and argue on what we should do in order to solve them. For the last few years, there is one challenge overshadowing everything. And that's what's going to happen with our democracy. We've been through 3 election rounds just this past year. Now it's around 50% chance of having another election round, a 4th one in 1 year. Throughout elections, Netanyahu is still prime minister with all the responsibilities and privileges of being prime minister, and with hardly any work in parliament. We saw in the last few years how the entities of democracy are in constant decline. And one thing that I noticed was, and that I realized at a certain point, was that democracies don't make a really big noise when they collapse. You don't see, it's very hard to see what's the exact point when a democracy becomes something different. And we don't have a name for that something different. It's very hard for us to imagine that something like this can happen to us, because we, somewhere in our minds, we think that democracy can only be destroyed in, with guns and in big revolutions, but actually it's a really, really slow process. And another terrifying notion is that populist leaders who are working against the interests of their country can win. So I'm not sure if winning is the exact definition, but they get some votes. And they know how to manipulate these votes, especially when you experienced a different example for it in the States. But here, because of the many, many, many parties that there are in Israeli politics, they know how he knows how to manipulate these votes in order to keep a certain coalition, a coalition of interest rather than a coalition of an actual vision. So what we saw in the last few years, and especially in the last year, was a prime minister under 3 corruption allegations who needs to be in court, in trial, keeping his dominance and control over the country during election rounds that keep the country in a complete chaos, while scaring his political rivals on an ongoing basis, every time with a new trick. And while citizens are slowly not just losing hope, but becoming a little bit apathic to the situation, thinking that nothing is ever going to change it. When the COVID arrived, that created the typical shock doctrine. People felt and were terrified by the crisis and what might happen. We saw for a few weeks prime minister speeches every night with no questions and answers to journalists, with a lot of fear rhetoric, with hardly any serious leadership, saying, this is a time of when we have to manage and to lead within a very unknown environment and very chaotic environment. But still, we see how in several places that managed to deal with the virus in quite a efficient way, we also see that their leaders tended to be much more honest and direct with their citizens, much more upfront and acknowledging the difficulties, and also using and trying to channel the community to try to solve it and deal with it together, which proved to be the most efficient way also in order to tackle the virus. Here what we saw was a lot of fear, and then slowly we saw how the virus is actually being used to threaten our democracy even farther. So at 1 a.m. one night, Netanyahu's trial was postponed in a few months with hardly any coverage on in the newspapers. We see how slowly the Israeli media is in an ongoing decline. Less and less journalists who are willing to fight for the truth. We see how truth itself is not a priority anymore in many different fields. And we see how our Supreme Court are very strong and democratic Supreme Court is struggling. More and more responsibilities that used to be in the hands of Parliament are now moving to the decision of the Supreme Court that is constantly attacked by politicians. And so what do we do? Oh, before the what do we do? And that's, I think, the worst point, is that we see how the leaders who were supposed to be leading the opposition to that and who were supposed to lead the fight to that, those who got actually the majority of votes in the elections together, just gave up and recently joined Netanyahu's coalition. So what do we do now? I think democracy is becoming a global challenge these days, and populist leaders become an enormous global challenge. As we saw during the fight against the virus, we see, I think one of the strongest notions that we see from the last few months is how we can't really just deal with our own national problems, because we're all in this together. We're all interlinked and influenced by each other. And we're influenced by the good examples, and we're influenced by the bad examples as well. And the only way to solve these problems is also globally. The biggest challenges of our society today are global, and democracy is becoming the biggest challenge of all. Because under a crisis like this, it's very easy for people to slowly give up on their personal and national freedoms, give up their privacy, give up their freedom of movement. Some of these compromises are a must when you deal with that kind of a threat. But we should never compromise our ability to ask questions and to search for the truth, and to make sure that when governments take these kind of severe steps, they are being supervised and overseen by parliaments and by other entities that can watch and look that they're actually serving the people and not political interests. I think when we understand that these kind of problems are global problems, we have to start thinking about global solutions. And when it comes to our democracy, I'm afraid that for the last few years, we're not really fighting together. In every country, and talking about Israel and the United States, I think are very strong examples at this front, because there's also a collaboration between our leaders, or alleged leaders. We are dealing with it on our own. Here in Israel, on the Israeli left, we definitely feel like we're dealing with it on our own all the time. Sometimes I try to explain to our colleagues in the American left that when they support, for example, the BDS, they're actually working against us on the progressive front in Israel, because they're disconnecting from us. Well, we're fighting for both peace and for our democracy and for sanity in our country, for freedom of religion, for freedom of practicing Judaism. When we are left alone, and when we are disconnected from our allies and our colleagues who can help echo our voices, help us strategize, help us work together, when we are disconnected, our goals and the reasons that we're in politics for are becoming more and more distant. And all of that is happening while the right wing is collaborating quite efficiently. They spread the same messages in Brazil, in the United States, in Hungary, and here in Israel, the very same stuff. They share resources, they help each other all the time. And what we should ask ourselves is, why are we not doing, not the same in the immoral way, but why are we not creating a similar kind of bond, helping each other, showing people and giving people hope back, giving them an example of what democracy can look like. And democracy is not a perfect form of government, but it's the best that we have. And if there is one challenge that we have to work for together now, is to make sure that truth becomes a real thing again, and is searched for and fought for, and that democracy, and that people understand again that democracy is there to serve them. It's not a form of some distant elite. It's there to serve their own freedom. Here the slogan on the that's going on, the government slogan on the COVID-19 is "Let's fight the virus." But the thing about COVID is that it's not really about fighting it. It's about healing it. And this whole time that we're going through is a time of healing. It's full of suffering. It's full of sacrifice. We have medical teams who are literally sacrificing their lives. We have thousands of volunteers. And I think suddenly, I don't know if it happened to you, it definitely happened here in my building. People met for the first time during the past months. They met their neighbors. For the first time, they knocked on the door of an older person who they knew is living alone, and they asked if they needed help. For the first time, they started to share resources and help each other. We have 1.5 million unemployed, 28% unemployment, and that happened in days. People are starting, although they don't have a job and they hardly get any support from the government, but they're starting to help each other on a regular basis, because that's actually who we are. And I think, rationally speaking, we know that the crisis that some political forces would do everything that they can in order to channel the crisis for their own good. And it will come at our expense. But just imagine what would happen if we'll channel this crisis for a real global healing. If we'll take the best that we're learning from this time, understanding our interdependency, understanding that we actually have the power to help each other, and how much more strong we are when we have our community and when we build a real community. Even if for many years it felt like something that is more nostalgic than real, it is real and it is helpful. And just imagine what we can do if we use this, in the same way that there is a global effort to find cure, to find a way to deal with it. Just imagine what would happen if there would be a global effort to solve our other problems, to solve conflicts, to solve and find better ways to accommodate immigrants and asylum seekers. Just imagine what kind of world, and of course, fight global warming, and climate change. Just imagine what kind of community and what kind of global community we can be if we'll take this challenge of healing and move it into the many other fields that we have to confront. In all of these different fields, we have to be together if we want to find a solution. So if to sum this up, my wish for Independence Day and for Israel is that we will truly appreciate the independence that our grandparents fought for and won't ever take it for granted. And we'll never get into despair and be afraid of fighting for our independence and for our freedom. And my bigger wish is that we'll find new partners and that we'll wake up from this crisis, understanding that we have a much bigger community than what we imagined and than what we had before, and that we can help each other in so many ways. There is really no challenge that we cannot solve. And this is the story of Israel. The story of Israel is the story of making the impossible possible. And it just takes really a small reminder to remind ourselves that that's who we are. We're supposed to be the people who are constantly thinking about tikkun olam and are constantly thinking about how we can solve challenges because nothing is impossible, and everything is in our hands to try and make our best in order to solve and make better. So thank you so much, Bet Simchat Torah. It's so much fun to be here with you tonight and to do this service with you. Thank you, Sharon. And I love you, and I love you all.